Picture a wedding. What do you see? For most of us in the West, a very specific image comes to mind. A bride in a white dress. A groom in a tuxedo. Organ music swells. They stand in a beautiful high-arched church, before a minister or a priest. They exchange sacred vows, not just to each other, but before God and these witnesses. The ceremony concludes with the famous words, "By the power vested in me, by God and the state, I now pronounce you." This entire ritual, which we call holy matrimony, is deeply embedded in our cultural DNA. We assume that this is what marriage is: a religious institution, a sacred rite, a sacrament invented and defined by the Church, with its roots stretching back to Jesus himself. We think of marriage as one of the core functions of a church, right alongside baptisms and funerals. But what if I told you this entire picture is a surprisingly modern invention? What if I told you that for the first 1,000 years of Christianity, the Church had almost nothing to do with weddings? What if I told you that Jesus never commanded his followers to get married in a specific religious ceremony? That the Apostle Paul had little to say on the ritual of marriage? And that for a millennium, a good Christian man and woman in Europe could get married simply by saying, "I marry you," to each other in their bedroom, with no priest, no church, and no witnesses required? How did the Church go from being a non-participant in marriage to the absolute gatekeeper of it? And how does this hidden history reframe the entire explosive modern debate about who gets to define marriage, the Church or the state? Today, we investigate the secret history of holy matrimony to find out when, and more importantly why, the Church got into the marriage business. To understand the change, we first have to erase our modern assumptions and look at what marriage was in the first century, at the time of Jesus and the birth of the Church. The world of the New Testament was dominated by two legal and cultural traditions, Jewish and Roman, and in both marriage was not a religious event. In Jewish tradition, as seen in the Old Testament, marriage was a social and family contract. A marriage was arranged between two families, often for economic or dynastic reasons. The key event was the signing of the ketubah, a marriage contract that stipulated the husband's financial obligations to the wife. The wedding itself was a community celebration, a feast, a party. But it was not a sacred ritual performed by a priest in the temple. It was a family and legal affair. In Roman law, which governed the entire empire, the concept was even simpler. For the Romans, marriage was a private, civil contract based on one, single, core idea. Consensus facit nuptias. Consent makes the marriage. That's it. If a man and a woman, both free citizens, were of legal age and consented to live together as husband and wife with the intentio maritalis, then they were married. There was no required state registration. No required religious ceremony. A procession to the groom's house deductio in Damam was common, as was a party, but these were social customs, not legal requirements. So, when Christianity began, its members Jews, Greeks, Romans, simply continued to get married in the way their culture had always gotten married. They made private, civil contracts. The early church's attitude towards this was essentially acceptance. The Apostle Paul wrote extensively about how to behave within a marriage: mutual submission, love, respect, but almost nothing about how to get married. For the first few centuries, Christian leaders simply advised believers not to marry pagans, and perhaps to seek a blessing from their local bishop after the fact, but this blessing was optional, not constitutive. It didn't make the marriage. The consent did. For 1,000 years, this was the norm. The Church recognized the civil, private, family-based contracts as valid marriages. It had no formal marriage business to speak of. So what changed? The first, slow shift began with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. With the collapse of Roman civil authority, Europe plunged into the Dark Ages, a period of political fragmentation and legal chaos. The single, unifying, and stable legal system that had governed marriage was gone. In its place, a patchwork of local, often pagan, Germanic tribal customs emerged. And these customs were often messy. They sometimes included polygamy, trial marriages, and, most problematically for the church, the practice of repudiation where a powerful feudal lord could simply repudiate or set aside his wife for any reason, like her inability to produce a male heir and take a new one. Into this legal and moral vacuum stepped the only stable, literate, organized, and transnational institution left in Europe, the Catholic Church. The Church began to assert its authority, not yet as a sacrament, but as a regulator. It was the only body that could create and enforce a consistent set of rules. Monks and bishops began to fiercely oppose the pagan custom of repudiation, arguing that marriage was a lifelong bond, as Jesus had taught. They began to legislate complex rules about consanguinity, who you couldn't marry. They expanded the forbidden list far beyond biblical incest, prohibiting marriage even to distant cousins or godparents, effectively giving the church veto power over many royal and noble alliances. Crucially, the church became the adjudicator when a powerful lord wanted to get rid of his wife. He couldn't just repudiate her anymore. He had to appeal to a church court, an ecclesiastical court, to grant him an annulment, a declaration that the marriage was never valid in the first place, perhaps because they were secretly sixth cousins, a rule only the church could navigate. See the shift. The church wasn't marrying people yet, but it was increasingly becoming the only institution that could say whether you were truly married or not. It was gaining jurisdiction. This creeping jurisdiction exploded into a full-blown hostile takeover in the High Middle Ages. The turning point was a massive internal power-up for the papacy known as the Gregorian Reform in the 11th century. Named after Pope Gregory VII, this was a movement to centralize all power in the papacy. The goal was to free the church from the control of secular kings and feudal lords, and to place the Pope as the supreme spiritual and temporal authority in Christendom. And to control the kings of Europe, you needed to control one thing: their lineage and succession. How do you control lineage? You must control marriage and divorce or annulment. The Gregorian reformers realized that as long as marriage was a private, civil contract, it was outside their ultimate control. They needed to bring it inside the church. They needed to transform it from something people did into something the church administered. How? By making a radical theological declaration: marriage is not a civil contract, it is a holy sacrament. A sacrament, like baptism and the Eucharist, is an outward sign, instituted by Christ, that confers an inward, divine grace. And if marriage is a sacrament, then only the church has the authority to define it, administer it, and adjudicate it. This idea, which had been floating around, was now pushed as a central, non-negotiable doctrine. The church began to argue that for a marriage to be truly valid in God's eyes, it must involve the church. This revolution culminated at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, convened by the most powerful pope of the Middle Ages, Pope Innocent III. This council was the peak of papal power, and it was here that the church's takeover of marriage was made official. 1. Marriage was formally affirmed as one of the 7 sacraments of the church. 2. The old Roman-style clandestine marriages were finally forbidden. 3. The council mandated the publishing of banns, a public announcement in the parish church for several weeks before the wedding, to ensure there were no impediments like being too closely related. 4. The wedding itself was moved from the home to the church door, in facie ecclesiae, in the face of the church, and a priest's presence and blessing became a mandatory part of the legal public ceremony. The transition was complete. In the space of about 150 years, the church had successfully moved marriage from a private contract into a public religious sacrament that it alone controlled. The church had gotten into the marriage business. This sacramental model, where the church is the ultimate gatekeeper of marriage, remained the law of the land in the West for 300 years. And then, in 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door. The Protestant Reformation was a direct attack on this very system. The Reformers rejected the idea that the church had 7 sacraments, arguing there were only 2 clearly instituted by Christ: baptism and communion. Marriage, for them, was not a sacrament. Martin Luther was absolutely clear on this. He wrote, "Marriage is a worldly thing that belongs to the realm of government." John Calvin agreed, calling the sacramental view of marriage absurd. The Reformation, in all Protestant countries, effectively reversed the Fourth Lateran Council. It secularized marriage once again. It took the legal authority away from the Church and gave it back to the civil government. This is why, in many Protestant countries like Germany or the Netherlands, a religious ceremony has no legal weight at all. You must go to the city hall and be married by a civil magistrate to be legally married. You can then have a separate church ceremony for a religious blessing, if you wish. The Anglican Church in England, and later the United States, created the hybrid system we know today. The state has the ultimate authority to issue a license, but it deputizes the minister or priest to act as an agent of both God and the state in a single ceremony. So, the history is a 1,000-year Gavor 1. Phase 10 to 1000 AD. Marriage is a private civil contract. The Church is not involved. 2. Phase 2 Miwi saying, Miwi 500 atu direito. The Catholic Church takes over, declaring marriage a sacrament under its exclusive control. Phase 3 1500 present. The Protestant Reformation splits the system. Catholicism doubles down on the sacramental view. Protestantism gives legal authority back to the state, creating the civil-religious hybrid we have today. This hidden history is not just a fascinating piece of trivia, it completely reframes the entire, explosive, modern American debate over marriage. For the last 20 years, we have heard intense arguments over issues like same-sex marriage. One side, the traditional religious side, has argued passionately that the state has no right to redefine marriage. They argue that marriage is a timeless, sacred, religious institution, defined by God in the Bible as the union of one man and one woman, and that the state is attacking or undermining holy matrimony. The other side, the secular or progressive side, argues that marriage is a civil right, and that the state does have the authority to grant this right equally to all citizens, regardless of orientation. But the history we've just uncovered adds a crucial, explosive layer to this debate. And this is the final question I leave with you. Is the traditionalist side correct? Is marriage a timeless, sacred, religious institution that the Church has always been the guardian of, and which the secular state is now trying to attack or redefine? Or is the progressive secular side actually the one with history on its side? Is the state not attacking a religious institution at all, but simply reclaiming its original, primary authority over an institution that was always, at its root, a private civil contract? Is the idea of marriage as an exclusively religious institution just a historical blip, a 300-year-long takeover by the medieval Church, which the modern world is now simply correcting as it returns marriage to its original, secular, contractual roots? Put simply, who does own marriage, the Church or the state? Let me know your thoughts, respectfully, in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into the hidden history of marriage fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content that uncovers the real stories behind our most sacred beliefs and practices. Thanks for watching.